I'm writing this because I need to tell someone about what happened to me. I live in Houghton, Michigan. It's in the Upper Peninsula, pretty far north. I work as a forest technician for the state, so I spend a lot of time out in the woods. Last month, in June, I was doing a survey of tree health in a remote area of the Sturgeon River Gorge Wilderness. It's part of the Ottawa National Forest. I had been out there for 3 days, camping and working. The weather was good, warm during the day but cool at night. On the 4th day, I woke up early like usual, around 5 a.m. I made some coffee on my little camp stove and started to pack up my gear. I remember it was really quiet that morning. Usually you hear birds and small animals, but there was nothing. I didn't think much of it at first. I just focused on getting ready for the day's work. I had a lot of ground to cover. Around 7 a.m., I started hiking to my first survey point of the day. It was about 2 miles from my campsite. As I was walking, I started to feel like something was off. The forest still seemed too quiet. I've spent years working in these woods, and I know how they're supposed to sound. This wasn't right. About halfway to my survey point, I stopped to check my map and GPS. That's when I first saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a trick of the light, but then it moved. It was about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. The creature was tall, at least 7 feet. Its skin looked rough and scaly, sort of a dark green color. The head was shaped kind of like a lizard's, but bigger. Its eyes were large and yellow. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was still half asleep or something. But when I looked again, it was still there. It was watching me. I stood there, not moving, for what felt like a long time. The creature didn't move either. We just stared at each other. I noticed more details. Its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. The hands had long fingers with what looked like claws. Then it took a step towards me. That's when I saw its feet. They were big, with 3 toes, each ending in a claw. It moved in a way that was both smooth and strange, not quite like anything I've seen before. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, but also fascinated. This thing, whatever it was, shouldn't exist. But there it was, right in front of me. It took another step towards me. I could see its chest moving as it breathed. Its scales seemed to shift color slightly as it moved, like they were reflecting the dappled sunlight coming through the trees. The creature tilted its head to the side like it was studying me. Its yellow eyes blinked, and I noticed it had a clear, thin eyelid that moved sideways across its eye. It opened its mouth slightly, and I saw rows of sharp, pointed teeth. I thought about trying to take a picture with my phone, but I was afraid to move. I didn't want to do anything that might startle it or make it aggressive. It took another step closer, and now it was only about 30 yards away. I could hear a low sound coming from it, kind of like a deep, rumbling hiss. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the forest, it seemed to fill the air. The creature raised one of its hands, palm facing towards me. I saw that its palm had some kind of textured pads on it, kind of like what you see on a lizard's feet, but bigger. It made that rumbling hiss sound again, a bit louder this time. I felt like it was trying to communicate something, but I had no idea what. Part of me wanted to say something back, but I was too scared to make a sound. Then it did something that really freaked me out. It stood up straighter, puffing out its chest and spread its arms wide. It looked even bigger than before. I don't know if it was trying to look threatening or if it was just stretching, but it scared me. That's when I decided I needed to get out of there. I started to back away slowly, keeping my eyes on the creature. It watched me go, turning its head to follow my movement. I got about 10 yards away when it suddenly made a loud hissing sound. That broke my trance. I turned and started walking away quickly. I didn't run, because I was afraid that might provoke it to chase me. I just walked fast, my heart pounding. After a few minutes, I looked back. The creature was gone. I couldn't see it anywhere. I kept walking, heading back to my campsite. I packed up everything as fast as I could and hiked out to my truck. I didn't report it to anyone at work. What would I say? That I saw a giant lizard man in the forest? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs or something. I've been back to work since then, but I haven't gone back to that specific area. I can't stop thinking about what I saw. I know it sounds impossible, but I know what I saw. It was real, and it was there in the woods of Michigan. We were driving to Niagara Falls through Canada. It's an easier route than going through the States from where I live outside of Detroit. Less traffic, speed limit is easier. You know, easy driving. I have a Ford Flex, big SUV van hybrid, so I packed it up, threw the kids in it, got my wife settled in, and headed out. We left early, around 3 a.m. We had to navigate through the city and over the Ambassador Bridge into Canada. The city was pretty much empty at that time, even the freeway, and it was nice to see the city without people for once. Kind of eerie too, but quiet and peaceful in a way. I rolled the window down a bit and just took in the early morning air. It was nice not to have to fight traffic, and there wasn't much construction, so none of the route was closed off or barreled off with construction barrels. My wife and kids fell back to sleep pretty fast. The kids as soon as we backed out of the driveway pretty much, and my wife after we went through security and over the bridge. Luckily, we weren't one of the random cars they stop and search. That might have freaked the kids out, but it didn't happen, thank goodness. I stopped at McDonald's in Windsor, right next to the bridge to get some coffee for the road, and then jumped right onto the provincial freeway heading out. It was great. There was still hardly any traffic, and barely a soul on the highway. I could have counted the number of cars I saw on one hand. It's hard for some people to stay awake on roads like this, though. They tell you to watch out for other cars, and especially sleepy truckers. You need to keep vigilant and all that. But I had the family with me, and coffee, so I was okay going slow. The first rest stop we hit after an hour on the highway, kids stayed asleep, and my wife and I took turns hitting the bathrooms. I especially needed it after all the coffee. There's like no one really around, so it can be kind of creepy. And sometimes, stuff happens at those rest stops. Anyway, I walked around the parking lot and around the car, stretching my legs after being in the seat for so long. The air was nice and cool for once. It had been pretty hot that week. There were a couple of semis parked and dark in the lot. Also, 2 other cars that seemed to be travelers like us, a family, and an older couple. The rest stops are usually pretty brightly lit to attract your eye from the road, I think. Also, for the safety factor. After I walked around a bit more, I finally got back in the car, and we headed back out onto the road. It was another maybe half hour, 38 minutes tops, barren highway, nothing but open countryside to either side. I go to yawn, and something dark moves across the road, and in that split second, I hit it. It's not deer season, it's June, so what the hell did I just hit? That was my first thought. I don't know why, maybe because of the size of it, but again, not deer season. What are the odds? Anyway, I slow the car down and get off to the side. My wife wakes up, and I tell her I think I hit something. Maybe a deer, maybe a dog, I don't know, but I don't want to scare the kids. I look in the rearview mirror and don't really see anything. I decide to get out of the car and use my phone as a flashlight. I just stood next to the car for a few minutes listening before I started to move super slowly back to see what I hit. I didn't see anything at first, but about maybe 10 feet from the car, I see a weird pale sack in the grass at the side of the road. I look around, shine the light, don't really see anything else. I walk up closer, and the sack gets bigger, and then the folds kind of move, and I stop. This thing then sort of unfolds itself and takes off. I mean, it really moves, and I drop my phone. I go to pick it up and follow where it's moving, and I see arms and legs shuffling, and this thing is heading for a group of trees. I'm just standing there in shock, trying to make out what the hell this thing is. What I thought was pale like sackcloth is skin, I think. and this thing is traveling on all fours. I didn't get a good look at its face, but I saw big black circles, maybe the eyes. It was moving so fast it was hard to tell. I thought about going after it. I even moved up closer towards the trees. It didn't make any noise, but I'm pretty sure I could hear it moving through the brush. But I stopped myself, thinking about the kids and my wife in the car. I just stood still, flashing my light near the trees, trying to see something. I couldn't hear it moving after a while. It just got quiet and still. I heard my wife call out to me, but it took a few seconds to register. We had been staying quiet so as not to wake the kids, but I guess I was out there too long for her liking. Rightfully so. I just got back to the car and sat down. I didn't know what to think or do. I just told her it was nothing and started the car back up. She knew something was up, but I just kept denying it. I think I was even denying it all to myself since I had no idea what had happened. It took maybe 2 days before I could bring myself to tell her what I saw, or at least what I think I saw. Of course, she believed me, but neither of us know what to think about it. And by then, we were so far away from where it happened that there was nothing we could do. So, to tell you the truth, we just dropped it and left it in the past and continued on with our vacation. Even so, it was the strangest experience in my life. I still don't believe it at times, but mostly I try not to think about it. I was a teenager and still in high school when this happened. Occasionally, my mom and I would drive around for hours to places that we didn't even know about, just aimlessly driving and wandering to some place that would get us away from everything. We've actually found many cool areas doing this. Now, the reason for us doing this wasn't very pleasant, and I'd rather not go into detail about it, but at least we have the memories that we do. It was a particularly bad day. My mom picks me up from school. She got to leave work early, and she says that we were going for another drive. I never complained because I knew my mom was dealing with enough already, so I did everything I could to make her happy. That meant smiling and sucking it up. It also meant never complaining about spending too much time in the car. Yeah, I was mature for my age because of my life. I did have siblings, but they were always with their friends. I had friends, but none that I really hung out with outside of school. I suppose I was more of a lone wolf than the social type. This meant that I was my mom's only company during the tougher days. As we are driving that day, the sky gets pretty gray. It looked like we were going to be driving in the rain, and I was okay with that. My mom is driving for some time before I realize that we are in the foothills, and from this area, we start heading up towards the mountains. We hadn't been to this area before. It was pretty cool, very green, and the road was full of all sorts of crazy twists and turns. My mom liked driving on roads like that. I think it made her feel invincible. There's a point when we eventually get to a flat area. I assumed it was the very top of this mountain. There's a road that leads straight ahead, but there's these weird gates. They sort of reminded me of those railroad gates that can open and close. They happened to be open. It looked really weird, but we were both curious about it, so we went in. There were a few huge metal boxes that looked like transformers or something. I figured they were somehow connected to the gate we drove through. And all around us is this really cool wooded area. We followed the road for some time. Eventually, we hit a dead end. At the end of the road was an enormous body of water. It looked like a lake, but it seemed to turn into rivers that led off into 2 different directions. It seemed peaceful, and that's what my mom needed. We climb out of the car and start to walk around the small area of land. If you were looking at the body of water from our car, there were different elements to notice. The first being that the area of land that we stood on obviously wrapped around the lake. But it was weird because we couldn't walk on any of the sides. We were stuck in the dead center of the lake. This was partly due to the area on the left and right of us being very steep and covered in rocks. There were 2 river-type things, as I mentioned, but they sort of swerved out to the northeast and northwest. It created a V shape almost. And then dead ahead of us was another area of land that was pretty far away from us. It was an interesting area for sure. I hadn't seen anything like it before. It was the purest silence I've ever heard in my whole life. No cars, no background noise, but there weren't any other noises either, which made it kind of eerie. We were out in nature, but we couldn't hear any signs of like birds or crickets or flying insects. It was dead quiet. It started to sprinkle the tiniest bit of rain, and even that sound seemed amplified. I remember my mom saying, "This is weird, huh?" It really was very weird, and I didn't think it could get much weirder. But it did. We looked out to the body of water and watched the small raindrops hitting the surface. The surface of the lake was super still, like freakily still, like I've never seen water so still, not even in a bathtub. So that's what made what we saw much more horrifying. As we looked out towards the body of water, we saw something rather large splash the water upwards. The sound alone was enough to frighten me. A loud splash after hearing nothing for several minutes was shocking, but the enormity of whatever forced the water up was unexplainable. I don't think it could have been a fish. If it was, that fish was humongous. I hadn't noticed prior, but I noticed at this point that there was a weird series of smaller objects sitting above the water off to my left. They almost looked like a row of rocks peeking out of the water. It must not have caught my eye before, being that the sides of us were pretty much covered by large rocks. But as soon as we saw that splash and the gigantic ripples it created in the lake, I started to wonder if those rocks weren't really rocks at all, but the back of something large hidden under the water. All of this observation took no time at all, and if I'm being truthful, I was much too frightened to stand there much longer. My mom started to usher me into the car, saying that we needed to leave, so we got in the car and left. I would have thought that my mind was playing tricks on me. All of what we had experienced was truly, for a lack of better words, creepy. And my mom started revisiting the events out loud as we drove. Everything she was saying was exactly what I saw too, and I can still hear her words. That wasn't a fish. It couldn't have been, right? All I know is that whatever it was made me so scared. I won't step foot near another lake or river again. I just won't. On September 3rd, 2023, Megan Chen, a 35-year-old park ranger, was conducting a routine patrol in Denali National Park, Alaska. Megan had worked in the park for over a decade and was one of its most capable rangers. This particular day, she was checking on some of the more remote campsites in the park's backcountry. Megan started her trek early in the morning, driving her park service truck as far as the road would take her before switching to an ATV for the rougher terrain. By mid-afternoon, she had reached the point where even the ATV couldn't go any further. She parked the vehicle, secured her gear, and continued on foot. The weather was typical for early September in Denali, cool and crisp, with a light breeze rustling through the autumn-tinged leaves. Megan breathed in the clean mountain air as she hiked, appreciating the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. She'd always felt at home here, surrounded by the vast, untamed landscape. As the day wore on, Megan checked off the campsites on her list one by one. She noted any signs of recent use, picked up any litter left behind, and made sure the bear-proof food storage containers were in good condition. It was important work, helping to keep both visitors and wildlife safe. Around 6 p.m., with the sun starting to dip lower in the sky, Megan reached the last campsite on her list. It was the most remote, situated near a small lake surrounded by dense forest. As she approached, she noticed something odd. The campsite looked like it had been used recently, but not in the usual way. The fire pit was cold, but the ashes had been scattered as if something large had walked through them or kicked at them. The bear-proof container was tipped over, which was really concerning since they were designed to be too heavy for animals to move easily. And strangest of all, there were large, barefoot prints in the soft soil around the campsite. Megan's first thought was that a large, mature male bear had wandered through, but these prints didn't look like any bear tracks she had ever seen. They were too large, too human-like. She took out her phone and snapped some photos, making sure to place a ruler next to one of the prints for scale. As she was documenting the scene, Megan heard a sound that made her stop. It was a low, rumbling noise, almost like a growl, but deeper and more resonant. It seemed to come from the forest beyond the campsite. Megan slowly stood up, her hand instinctively going to the bear spray on her belt. She scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. The forest was eerily still, the usual sounds of birds and small animals notably absent. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among the trees, a darker patch against the dimming light. But as Megan watched, the shadow moved. It stepped forward, revealing a massive, fur-covered figure that stood upright on two legs. The creature was easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, and its arms hung long at its sides, almost reaching its knees. The head sat directly on broad shoulders, with no visible neck. For a moment, Megan wondered if she was looking at a bear standing on its hind legs. But as the creature moved again, taking another step towards the campsite, she realized this was no bear. Its movements were too fluid, too balanced. It walked with purpose, its gait unmistakably bipedal. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, seemingly aware of Megan's presence. It turned its head towards her, and Megan found herself looking into a face that was both familiar and alien. The eyes were deep set under a heavy brow, the nose broad and flat. The mouth was wide, with thin lips pulled back slightly to reveal large teeth. Megan stood perfectly still, her years of wildlife training kicking in. She knew sudden movements could provoke an attack, but this situation was unlike anything she had ever been trained for. Her mind kept circling back to one impossible thought: Bigfoot. Was she really face to face with the legendary creature? The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. The creature made no move to approach further, and Megan didn't dare to move away. They simply watched each other, two intelligent beings trying to assess the situation. Finally, the creature made a sound. It wasn't the deep rumble from before, but a softer, almost chirping noise. It repeated the sound 3 times, then slowly backed away into the forest. Megan watched as it disappeared among the trees, its dark fur blending perfectly with the shadows. Once she was sure the creature was gone, Megan let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled as she reached for her radio, but she hesitated before making the call. Who would believe her? What would she even say? In the end, Megan decided to document everything she could before leaving. She took more photos of the prints and the disturbed campsite. She recorded a detailed voice memo describing what she had seen and heard, and she collected a few strands of coarse, dark hair that she found caught on a low-hanging branch near where the creature had stood. As darkness fell, Megan began the long trek back to her ATV. Her mind was spinning with questions. What exactly had she seen? Was it really the legendary Bigfoot, or some unknown species of animal? And what should she do with this information? Megan knew that reporting a Bigfoot sighting could potentially damage her career. People might think she was crazy or seeking attention, but as a scientist and a park ranger, she also felt a responsibility to report her observations, no matter how unbelievable they might seem. The hike back to her vehicle seemed to take twice as long as usual. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made Megan jump, wondering if the creature was following her. By the time she reached her ATV, she was exhausted both physically and mentally. As Megan drove back to the ranger station, she decided to sleep on it before making any reports. She needed time to process what had happened and figure out the best way to present her experience. One thing was certain: her view of Denali National Park had changed. Megan Chen arrived back at the ranger station late that night, her mind full of questions. But what she would do with that evidence and how it might change her life and career remained to be seen. We'll be following up, hoping for an update, and we'll be sure to share what we find.